I grew up in Mom's community garden. She'd sit under the fig tree telling me where to plant while I worked the soil. When she died, my sister chained the gate. "It's going to the highest bidder," she hissed. "Finally, this dump can make me some money." On auction day, people called out prices. I waited until it went quiet, then I stood and said $1, just as Mom wrote in her will. My name is Theresa McLean, and I'm 34 years old. For as long as I can remember, my life has been measured in seasons of planting and harvesting, of turning soil and waiting for rain. The community garden wasn't just my mom's project. It was our home without a roof, a quarter-acre of life humming between silent, gray apartment buildings. I can still feel the rough, deeply grooved bark of the giant mission fig tree that anchors the whole place. Mom planted it the year I was born, and its branches have shaded every important moment of my life. It's the heart of this place, its steady, beating heart. She taught me everything I know under that tree. She taught me how to read the soil, to know what the pale, curling edges of a leaf were trying to tell us. It was a language, a secret conversation between us and the earth, and she passed it down to me like a family heirloom. While my sister Carla was away at college learning about spreadsheets and profit margins, I was learning how to coax life from dirt, how to feel the promise of a seed in the palm of my hand. My mom, Alina McLean, passed away last week. Cancer, it's a thief, that disease. It took her slowly, piece by piece, then all at once, leaving a silence that's louder than any noise I've ever heard. In her final hours, her breath as thin as a cobweb, she gave me her old gardening journal. Its leather cover was worn smooth and dark from her hands, the spines soft and yielding. "Everything you need is in here, Theresa," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. I took it, not understanding, my grief a thick fog that blurred the edges of everything. I just held on to it, a final piece of her to carry into the quiet that was coming. Carla, my older sister, arrived for the funeral looking like she'd stepped out of a magazine. She wore a black designer dress that probably cost more than we spent on seeds in a year, and her sleek Italian leather shoes looked like they'd shatter if they touched real earth. She drifted through the small gathering at the funeral home like a ghost from a different, more expensive world. She barely glanced at the photos of Mom smiling in the garden, didn't share a single story. Her eyes kept drifting to the window, looking out toward the house, toward the quarter-acre of green that glowed in the afternoon sun. She wasn't seeing Mom's legacy, she was seeing land. She wasn't seeing a sanctuary built with love and sweat, she was seeing square footage. During the reception, I was in the kitchen trying to find more napkins when I overheard her on the phone, her voice a low, sharp hiss that cut through the murmur of condolences. "Prime location," she was saying, "easy to clear. The big tree will have to go, obviously, but the footprint is perfect." My stomach went cold. She wasn't mourning our mother, she was assessing an asset, running numbers on our childhood. The day after we buried Mom, Carla's coldness became an action. She found me in Mom's bedroom, sorting through her scarves, each one still holding a faint trace of her rose-scented perfume. "You need to clear all this out by the end of the week," she said, not looking at me but at the room, as if mentally measuring it for new furniture. "Not we, but you." She tapped a manicured finger on a stack of legal papers she was holding. "I'm the executor of the will," she announced, the words precise and metallic. "I have to handle the estate efficiently." Efficiently, that's what she called erasing a life. 2 days after the funeral, the grief was a physical weight on my chest. I couldn't breathe in the house filled with Mom's absence, so I went to the one place that always made sense, the garden. I needed the familiar feel of the soil under my nails, the quiet hum of the bees in the lavender bushes. But when I got there, my key wouldn't fit in the lock. A thick, greasy industrial chain was wrapped around the iron gate, woven through the bars like a metal snake. A brand-new, heavy-duty padlock gleamed in the morning sun, an obscene piece of hardware on our old, welcoming gate. Zip-tied to the bars was a stark white sign. "No trespassing," the black letters screamed. It felt like a slap in the face. my breath caught in my throat. I fumbled for my phone, my heart pounding with a sick mix of disbelief and rising fury. I called Carla. She answered on the second ring, her voice clipped and impatient. "What? There's a lock on the garden, Carla. I can't get in." Her reply was like a shard of ice in my ear. "Stay out, Theresa. It's being prepped for sale." "Sale?" I choked out the word. "Mom wanted it to stay a garden for the community, forever." I heard her laugh, a short, ugly sound with no humor in it. Mom was a sentimental fool who didn't understand the value of $1. "This dump is finally going to make me some real money. Don't even think about cutting that lock. I'm the executor. It's over." She hung up. I stood there, locked out of the only place that had ever felt like home, staring through the bars at the fig tree. Its leaves rustled in a breeze that felt like a long, sad sigh. It was over. She had declared it, and just like that, it was supposed to be true. I called Carla back a dozen times that afternoon. Each call went straight to her voicemail, her professionally recorded message a smooth, impenetrable wall. Finally, a text message blinked onto my screen. It wasn't even from her, really. It was pure legal threat distilled into a few cold words. "I am the executor. This is my legal right. Every call you make is harassment." Stop. The clinical language was more jarring than any insult she could have thrown at me. She was using the law as a shield, hiding behind paragraphs and clauses to avoid being a sister, to avoid being human. Desperate, I drove to the sleek downtown hotel where she was staying, thinking if I could just see her, just talk to her face to face, I could make her understand. The concierge, a young man with a polite, fixed smile, called her room. I stood there, twisting the strap of my purse, and could hear the tinny, faint sound of Carla's voice through the receiver on his desk. His smile tightened. "I'm sorry, ma'am, she's not accepting visitors." She was a fortress, and I didn't have a battering ram. I didn't even have a pebble to throw against the walls. That night, I wrote her a long, heartfelt email. I poured everything out. I talked about Mom's hands in the dirt, about her dying wish, about the elderly couple who relied on the vegetables from their plot, about us, about the memories of us as kids hiding under the fig tree. I begged her to reconsider. Her reply came within the hour. It was a single sentence, a forwarded message from a man I'd never heard of. It said, "All future communication regarding the estate of Alina McLean must be directed to my office." She hadn't just shut me out. She had outsourced the job. She wasn't my sister anymore. She was an opponent in a game I didn't know how to play. The next morning, I was standing at my kitchen sink, staring blankly out the apartment window that overlooked the garden when I saw them. Two men in bright yellow vests were unrolling a set of blueprints on the hood of their truck. And standing beside them, pointing, gesturing with sharp, decisive movements, was Carla. She was a queen directing her troops, her expensive black dress a stark slash against the garden's green. They were surveyors. They walked through the garden as if it were nothing more than a grid on a map, their heavy boots crushing the delicate alyssum that bordered the stone path. I watched, frozen, as one of them walked right through the hydrangea bushes Mom and I had planted for my 12th birthday. The big blue flower heads bounced and snapped. He didn't even notice. I felt a sharp, physical pain in my chest, as if I'd been struck. They started driving stakes into the ground, thin wooden posts topped with fluttering pink plastic ribbons marking out plots for destruction. Each thud of the hammer against the wood was a blow against my own heart, a countdown to the end of everything I loved. This was the first wound, the first physical violation that proved this nightmare was real. As they worked, Carla glanced up, her eyes scanning the building across the street. She saw me standing in my window. For a split second, our eyes met. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She just gave a small, smug smile, a tiny, triumphant curl of her lips before turning back to the men and their plans. The smile was the cruelest part. It said, "I see you. And I don't care." The shame of it all was a bitter taste in my mouth. A few days later, Mr. Henderson, the retired history teacher who has managed the cucumber patch for 20 years, stopped me in the hallway of my building. His face, usually so cheerful, was etched with deep lines of worry. "Theresa," he said, his voice quiet, The gate's been locked for days. Is everything all right with the garden? I had to tell him. I had to stand there and explain that my own sister, Alina's daughter, was selling it. The words felt like poison on my tongue. She's the executor, I stammered. She's selling it. The look of confusion and hurt on his face was almost more than I could bear. News travels fast in a close-knit community like ours. My phone started buzzing with texts and calls from the other garden members, a small, frantic chorus of disbelief. Maria, who grew the best peppers on the block, was heartbroken. Sam, a young father who brought his daughter every Saturday to teach her about plants, was furious. Alina promised us, they all said in one way or another. This garden is the only beautiful thing on this block. They looked to me for answers, for a plan, for some hope that I could fix this. But I had nothing. My desperate calls and emails had failed. My attempts to reason with Carla had been met with a wall of lawyers and smug smiles. I was as powerless as they were. I had no legal standing, no way in, no voice that my sister was willing to hear. The garden, our garden, was dying, and the person holding the poison was my own flesh and blood. A week later, a glossy brochure appeared in my mailbox, tucked between a pizza menu and a credit card offer. I almost threw it away, but the photo on the front stopped me cold. It was an artist's rendering of a sleek glass and steel condo building, all sharp angles and sterile balconies, standing exactly where the garden should be. Above the image, in an elegant, scrolling font, were two words that made me feel sick to my stomach. It read, "The Alina." She had named the monstrosity after our mother. The hypocrisy was so staggering it almost took my breath away. I opened it, my hands shaking. Inside, the garden was described as an underutilized urban lot, a phrase that felt like a deliberate insult. Its potential, the brochure claimed, was ready to be unlocked. They were erasing my mom's entire life's work with a few lines of slick marketing jargon, reducing her passion to a problem that needed a bulldozer to solve. The brochure listed the details of a public auction, scheduled just 2 weeks from now. It was a ticking clock, and suddenly it was screaming in my ears. Seeing our shared memories of dirt and sunshine twisted into a sales pitch for luxury condos did something to my grief. It felt like the heavy, wet blanket of sadness was finally being burned away by a clean, white-hot flame. It left behind something harder, something sharper, pure anger. I didn't throw the brochure away. I smoothed it out and put it on my kitchen table, a constant, ugly reminder of what I was fighting against. This wasn't just about saving a garden anymore, it was about stopping her. The community's sadness became a constant, suffocating presence. My neighbors, people who had watched me grow up, now looked at me with a new expression in their eyes, pity. They'd see me in the grocery store sorting through avocados, and they'd approach with a sad smile. "Such a shame about your mother's garden, dear," they'd whisper, patting my arm. They meant well, I know they did, but every sympathetic glance felt like a confirmation of my failure. It was another nail in the coffin of my mother's legacy, and I was the one standing by, unable to stop the funeral. Carla's aggressive marketing was working. The glossy brochures, the for sale by auction sign that now stood chained to the garden gate, it all made the sale feel inevitable, a force of nature that couldn't be stopped. The more progress she made, the more isolated and vulnerable I felt. I started avoiding people. I'd take the back stairs to my apartment to avoid running into Mr. Henderson. I'd wait until late at night to take out the trash. I just couldn't bear to see their sad, disappointed eyes one more time. The social pressure was smothering me. I had become the face of this loss, the daughter who couldn't protect the one thing her mother loved most. But Carla, in her arrogance, didn't realize what she was also doing. Her very public campaign wasn't just selling a piece of land. It was cementing her role as the villain in the neighborhood story, a story that people would remember for a very long time. I couldn't sleep. Most nights I'd just sit in the dark by my living room window, staring across the street at the chained-up garden. It looked like a prison, its beauty held captive. One night, as I sat there, my gaze drifted to my bedside table. Mom's gardening journal was sitting right where I'd left it the day she died. I'd been too grief-stricken to open it, too afraid that turning its pages would feel too final, like closing the book on her life. But her last words echoed in my mind, a faint but persistent whisper, "Everything you need is in here." I needed her now more than ever. I needed her guidance, her strength, something to hold on to in this storm. With a deep breath, I picked it up. The worn leather was soft and familiar under my fingertips. I opened the cover and it smelled faintly of her, of rich soil and the rose-scented hand cream she always used. I started to flip through the pages. There were her beautiful, precise sketches of tomato plants, detailed notes on rainfall from a summer 5 years ago, a list of remedies for aphids. There were pressed leaves from the fig tree, their delicate skeletons taped carefully to the page. It was her whole life, written in her familiar, looping handwriting. I sat there and read for hours, losing myself in her world, feeling her presence in the quiet of my apartment. It wasn't a solution, not yet. But as I read her words, a tiny, fragile flicker of hope began to glow in the darkness. The problem wasn't just bigger than I had assumed, maybe, just maybe, the solution was, too. I just had to find it. I reached the final pages of the journal, my fingers tracing the lines of her weakening handwriting from the last few months of her life. The pages were mostly empty, a testament to how the cancer had stolen her strength. But as I closed the book, I felt something stiff inside the back cover. It was a slight bulge in the leather, something I'd never noticed before. My heart started to beat a little faster. I ran my fingers over the spot and found the edge of a hidden pocket, the seams stitched so tightly into the binding it was almost invisible. It was a secret place, meant to be found. With trembling fingers, I carefully worked the contents free. It was a single sheet of paper folded into a small, tight square. The paper was old and thick, the creases worn soft and fragile from years of being tucked away. I carried it over to my lamp and carefully unfolded it. It wasn't a letter or a note. It was an official-looking document, the paper a heavy, creamy stock with a faded but official notary's seal embossed at the bottom. The heading, typed in an old-fashioned font, read, "Addendum to Deed, the Caretaker's Covenant." This was it. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that this was the first hard proof that I wasn't outmatched. Mom hadn't left me helpless, she had left me a shield. Or maybe, just maybe, she had left me a sword. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the paper still. I read the dense, typed words, my eyes flying across the page. The language wasn't complicated legal nonsense, it was simple, direct, and absolutely brilliant. It stated that upon the death of the owner, Elena McLean, the individual designated as the property's caretaker had the primary and absolute right to purchase the property. And there, typed in clean black ink, was the name of the designated caretaker, my daughter, Theresa McLean. I had to read it 3 times before the words sank in. The purchase price for the caretaker was set at the symbolic sum of $1. But there was a condition, a promise I would have to make. The caretaker had to agree in writing to maintain the property as a community green space for a minimum of 10 years. And then came the final clause, the one that made me gasp out loud. It was the masterstroke, the hidden teeth in the trap. If the executor of the estate, Carla, refused this offer or attempted to sell the property to any other party, all assets of the entire estate, including the proceeds from any sale, would be immediately forfeited to the City Parks Department. It was all there. My mother hadn't just tried to protect the garden. She had anticipated Carla's greed. She had laid a perfect, patient trap, and my sister was walking right into it with her eyes wide open, blinded by the dollar signs. My first instinct was to run. I wanted to storm over to her hotel, shove the paper in her smug, smiling face, and watch her perfect composure shatter into a million pieces. I wanted that short, satisfying flash of victory. But I stopped myself, my hand on the doorknob. That would be my victory, not Mom's. She had planned for something bigger, something more complete. A quiet war, I realized, would be far more effective. The auction date, which had been my greatest fear, was suddenly my greatest weapon. It was no longer a threat, it was an opportunity. This wasn't something I could handle alone. I needed a professional, someone who knew how to wield a weapon like this with precision, and then I remembered him. Martin Blake, the lawyer who lived a few blocks away. He'd bought tomatoes from Mom's stand every Saturday for years, always telling her she had the best soil in the state. He respected her and he understood what the garden meant. I carefully folded the covenant, slid it into a clean envelope, and for the first time in weeks I made a plan. This was no longer about pleading or begging for scraps of my own history. This was about enforcement. I was done playing defense. It was time to go on the attack. Martin Blake's office was on the second floor of a charming old brownstone, and every single windowsill was filled with thriving, happy plants. It was a good sign. He was a kind-faced man with laugh lines around his eyes, and he remembered me and my mother instantly. He stood up from his big wooden desk and shook my hand, his expression softening as he offered his condolences for my loss. "Your mother was a wonderful woman, Theresa," he said, and I knew he meant it. I didn't waste time with small talk. I sat down and slid the envelope across his polished desk. "I need your help, Mr. Blake." He opened it, unfolded the covenant, and began to read. His eyebrows went up slightly. He read it again, more slowly this time, and a slow, sharp smile spread across his face. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a predator who has just caught the scent of blood. He looked up at me, his eyes gleaming with professional delight. "Your mother," he said, leaning back in his chair, "was a genius." He swiveled around and went to a tall metal filing cabinet, pulling out a dusty city registry book from the 1990s. He licked his thumb and flipped through the thick pages. A minute later, he stopped, running his finger down a column. "Here it is," he said, tapping the page. "Filed and recorded. It's real, it's ironclad." The words washed over me. This major truth flipped my entire world right side up again. I wasn't a trespasser. I wasn't a pathetic, sentimental child. I was the rightful heir, and the feeling that surged through me wasn't just relief, it was power. "We could send a cease and desist letter right now," Martin said, laying the covenant flat on his desk like a sacred text. "Shut this whole circus down by tomorrow morning." His words were a tempting promise of immediate peace. No more sleepless nights, no more pitying looks from my neighbors, but then he paused, a thoughtful glint in his eye. "But," I asked, sensing there was more. "But," he continued, leaning forward and lowering his voice conspiratorially, "your sister is spending a lot of money right now. A whole lot of money. She's hired a premium auction house and their commission isn't cheap. She's paying for marketing, those glossy brochures, that big sign. She's paying for event setup, for legal consultations on the sale." He let the words hang in the air. "All of that is a significant, non-refundable investment." He explained it simply. "If we waited, if we let her go through with the auction, her financial loss would be catastrophic. She'll be on the hook for every single penny she's spent," he said, that sharp smile returning. "And when the sale falls through because of this document, the auction house will almost certainly sue her for the commission she promised them on a multi-$100,000 sale. She'll be ruined." He was giving me a choice, simple victory or total annihilation. The advice was cold-blooded, calculated, and it was exactly what I wanted to hear. It was an irreversible choice. The moment I agreed to this, there was no going back. I couldn't pretend to be the nice, quiet sister ever again. I sat there in his quiet, sunny office and thought about the trampled hydrangeas. I thought about the cold, industrial chain on the gate. I thought about her condescending laugh on the phone, the smug smile she gave me from the garden. To win this, I had to become as ruthless as she was. I had to watch her build her own stage, climb her own gallows, and not shout a single word of warning. My goal, I realized, was no longer just to save the garden. That was the baseline, the bare minimum. The new goal was to make Carla pay for her greed, for her blatant disrespect, for trying to pave over our mother's memory to build a soulless glass box. I wanted her to feel the consequences in the only language she had ever truly understood. "Money," I looked Martin Blake right in the eye. "Let her set up the party," I told him, my voice steady and cold. "We'll show up right after the bidding is done." I walked out of his office feeling transformed. The heavy cloak of grief had been replaced by something that felt like armor. I was no longer just a grieving daughter. I was the custodian of my mother's final, brilliant act of revenge. Believing I had finally given up, Carla escalated her campaign of desecration. A few nights before the auction, she hosted a pre-auction mixer for the prospective buyers right there in the garden. I watched from my apartment window, a silent, helpless observer to the violation. Caterers in white coats set up tables with champagne buckets right on top of the lettuce beds. They laid down temporary flooring over Mom's prize-winning zinnias. I watched as men in expensive, ill-fitting suits drank champagne and laughed too loudly, stubbing out their cigars in Mom's favorite terracotta pots. They were celebrating on her grave before she was even cold in it. The garden was no longer a safe space for me to even look at. It felt tainted, desecrated. And in the middle of it all was Carla, laughing, shaking hands, her gestures expansive as she sold a future that would never, ever exist. Her arrogance was a performance, a grand show for her audience of developers. She was so sure that she had already won, so certain of her victory that she felt completely and utterly untouchable. This wasn't just about selling land anymore. She was actively, gleefully erasing our history on it before the ink was even dry on a contract. Every burst of laughter I heard through my open window, every clink of a champagne glass, solidified my commitment to the plan. It hardened my resolve until it was as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. At the same time, Carla began a quiet, poisonous campaign to discredit me in the community. Mrs. Gable, a sweet, elderly woman from down the hall, knocked on my door one afternoon, looking worried. She told me she'd overheard Carla in the building lobby that morning, talking loudly on her phone, making sure anyone nearby could hear. Carla was telling someone that I was emotionally unstable after Mom's death, that I was living in a fantasy world and couldn't accept the necessary financial realities of the situation. She was painting me as a pathetic, sentimental child, a hysteric who was clinging to a worthless patch of dirt out of a misplaced sense of grief. This was the public consequence of my silence. By choosing a secret war, I had given her complete control of the narrative, and she was using it to make me look like the villain or worse, like a fool. I started to notice a change in the neighborhood. Some of the neighbors who had offered me pity now offered me distance. Their supportive smiles were replaced with awkward, averted eyes. They were being swayed by her lies. My isolation deepened. It felt like a constraint tightening around my chest, forcing me to rely on nothing and no one but the secret I held, the single piece of paper tucked away in a manila folder in my closet. A knock came at my door mid-morning, sharp and businesslike. When I opened it, a man in a neat blue shirt was standing there with a clipboard and a tidy smile that didn't reach his eyes. He smelled faintly of aftershave and copy paper. "Delivery for Miss McLean," he said, making sure to glance down at the name on the envelope as if to prove how official he was. The envelope was thick and a little stiff, my name typed in heavy black letters. I signed with a pen that was attached to the clipboard with a chain, the whole ritual cold and precise, like a small ceremony where the only guest was dread. I shut the door and stood there for a second, listening to the quiet hum of my fridge and the faraway beep of a truck backing up on the next street. Morning light cut a stripe across my kitchen floor. I slipped a finger under the flap and tore it open. Inside was a letter that sounded friendly at first glance. "We would like to assist you during this transition," and then got sharp. There was a check paperclip to it, $5,000, my name printed clean and correct. The letter said if I agreed to cooperate, if I moved out of my apartment, which was in a building owned by the estate, within 30 days I'd get the money. It said my prompt departure would help the estate be handled efficiently. That word again, efficiently. The check was crisp and new, the ink so fresh it almost shone. For a second, my fingers wanted to fold it, to tuck it into my wallet and pretend life could be that simple. I pictured boxes stacked in my living room, my plants in the backseat of a borrowed car, my neighbors whispering that it was sad but practical. That was the trap. It wasn't an offer, it was a shove. It was a hand pushing me toward the door. I sat at my table, the garden brochure still spread open like a wound. I laid the check on top of it and stared at both until the two pieces of paper felt like they were humming with the same ugly energy. My hands didn't shake this time. I stood, walked into my bedroom, and slid open my closet. On the top shelf was a stack of old shoe boxes, and behind them a plain, worn manila folder. I pulled it down and carried it to my bed. The covenant was inside, along with a few carefully kept receipts from the garden and the copy of Mom's will. I added the letter and the uncashed check to the pile. I could have ripped the check in half. That would have felt satisfying for about 5 seconds. Then it would be gone, and so would the proof of what she was willing to do to me. I put the folder back on the shelf and stood there in the dim closet for a long moment. Dust floated in a thin beam of light that made its way through the blinds. 30 days. I thought about the fig tree and how it had stood tall for 34 years without asking anyone's permission. I thought about my mother's voice, steady and sure. "Everything you need is in here," she'd told me. I wasn't going anywhere. 2 days later, a soft, careful knock sounded on my door. It was the kind of knock that told you the person on the other side meant no harm. I opened it to find Mrs. Gable, small and hunched in her pale blue cardigan, her gray hair pinned neatly at the back of her head with a barrette shaped like a leaf. She had a cardboard box clutched against her stomach with both hands. The box looked old and tired, one corner sagging, a strip of worn tape running across the top. Her eyes were watery, but her voice was steady. "I've been holding this for you," she said quietly. "Your mother asked me to a while back. She said to give it to you only if Carla tried to sell the garden." For a second, I couldn't move. My breath caught just like it had at the gate that first day. I reached for the box, and it was heavier than it looked. We carried it inside together and set it down on my kitchen table. Mrs. Gable brushed a bit of dust off the lid like she was comforting it. "She brought it down to my apartment on a Sunday afternoon," she said, her voice going soft with the memory. "She said, when the time comes, Mrs. Gable will know." I didn't know what she meant. I suppose I do now. She touched my arm. "Your mother was careful, Theresa. She was smarter than anyone gave her credit for. Don't forget that." I nodded. My voice felt like sandpaper. "Thank you." She gave my hand a quick squeeze and left, closing the door with that same gentle care. The box smelled like an attic. When I cut the old tape with a butter knife and opened the flaps, a puff of dust rose up and sparkled in the sunbeam like tiny stars. On top were old seed catalogs with curled edges, the kind we used to order from at the kitchen table with a pot of tea between us, arguing over whether we needed 3 kinds of beans or 4. There were a few handwritten notes paper-clipped together, lists of what was planted in which bed, a recipe for compost tea written on the back of a grocery receipt, Mom's neat letters marching across the page. I dug deeper. Under the catalogs was a stack of envelopes bound together with a faded ribbon, the color long gone but the knot still tight. The envelopes were all the same size and off-white color, some with coffee rings on them, some bent at the corners as if they'd been handled many times. My stomach dropped when I saw the handwriting. Carla's. Even before I pulled the bundle into my hands, I knew the slant of those letters, the way she looped the lowercase y like she was drawing a fishhook. On the top envelope, my mother had written one word in pencil, "Keep." It wasn't for the mail, it was for me. I sat down and pulled the knot loose. The ribbon fell away and slid across the table like a sigh. I opened the first envelope and slid out the letter. The paper was thin and crackled a little at the edges. The date at the top was 15 years ago. I read the first line and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft sneaking under the window. "Mom," it began, "I need some help with a business plan. It's just a loan. I'll pay you back." The letter went on for 2 pages, all charm and confidence and vague promises. I turned the page and saw Mom's handwriting in the margin, a single note, "Gave her 2,000. There was a check number. My mother had kept everything. I worked my way through the years, letter by letter. The tone shifted as time wore on. The charm thinned out and something harder took its place. "Mom, the market is bad right now. I'll make it up to you when things turn around. then I need you to be supportive. I'm drowning here and you're sitting on a piece of land that could solve this. Then, sharper, it's not fair that you expect me to struggle while you waste resources on dirt. The words were a slap even on paper. I was glad Mom hadn't let me see these when she was alive. I would have marched to wherever Carla was and thrown them at her face. I found one written 3 years ago. The paper was creamy like it had come from an expensive notepad. This garden is a gold mine you're sitting on, she'd written, neat and cold. If you won't give me what I'm owed, I'll get it the second you're gone. I sat back hard, the chair legs squeaking against the tile. My breath came faster. I waited for the sting of tears, but none came. Under that letter was another. The date was a year before that. Your stupid, dirty hobby is costing me a comfortable future, she wrote. Sell the land, it's time to be realistic. I kept reading. There were notes about down payments on condos she couldn't afford, about failed deals she blamed on everyone but herself. Sometimes the letters were scrawled and messy, as if she'd written them in a rush. Sometimes they were typed crisp and cool, as if a screen made it easier to say cruel things. In between, there were receipts, little proof that Mom had helped when she could. $50 here, $100 there, a note in Mom's hand. Told her, I can't keep doing this. I pictured my mother at the kitchen table, her face calm but tired, folding each letter and tucking it into an envelope with that faded ribbon. She had been saving these not just for me but for a day like this when the truth would matter more than politeness. By the time I got to the last letter, my coffee had gone cold and the sun had shifted across the floor. The final one was short. If you don't do this my way, Carla wrote, I'll make it happen another way. You can't keep me from what I deserve. There was no signature, just her name typed at the top like a title. I placed the letter down carefully as if it might break. The edges of my vision felt sharp, like the day after a storm when everything is too clear. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. The letters lay in a loose, messy fan across the table, a paper map of every greedy thought she'd ever tried to dress up as need. And there, next to them, still open to that ugly picture of glass and steel, sat the brochure for the condo that bore my mother's name. My hands were flat on the table. My nails were short and ragged, still carrying soft crescents of dirt from a morning spent potting a cutting-eyed snuck from the edge of the garden fence. I realized I was grinding my teeth. I forced my jaw to unclench. The letters didn't just make me angry, they made things simple. It was never about a piece of land, it was about a belief my sister had built her life on. That she was owed everything and that Mom and I were just obstacles between her and what she wanted. I thought back to every holiday where she breezed in with shiny bags and complaints about the cost of parking, every phone call where she barely asked about our lives but had a lot to say about her own. I thought about the way she stood under the fig tree at the mixer, her laugh bright and sharp, as men tossed ashes into terracotta. Whatever tiny, flickering hope I'd kept alive in a quiet corner of my heart where childhood lived, that someday we might be sisters again, that maybe, if the garden were safe, we could sit under the fig tree and share a bowl of sun-warmed strawberries and remember we loved the same woman, that hope went out. It didn't scream or sputter, it just gave one last soft glow and then it was gone. In its place, I felt something cold and clear settle in. It wasn't cruelty, it was certainty. I gathered the letters into a neat stack and slipped them back into their envelopes, tying the ribbon back around them. I wiped the dust from my fingers on a dish towel, then I walked to the bedroom and took the manila folder down again. I opened it on the bed and placed the bundle of letters with the covenant and the uncashed check. It wasn't a file for a judge, it was for me. It was the truth I could touch and hold if my courage wobbled. It was the voice of my mother, steady and smart, saying, "Stand up straight, Theresa, keep going." The auction was in 2 days. Those words felt like a drumbeat in the walls. 2 days. The clock ticked and the late afternoon light turned honey gold, then orange, then blue. I stood at my window and looked at the garden. Floodlights were stacked by the fence, a neat pile of metal bones. The sign on the gate fluttered in a small wind. I watched a single robin hop along the top of the fence, tilt its head, and fly away. There was no more room in me for doubt. There was no loose thread of sympathy left to tug at. Carla had written her intentions in ink long before Mom got sick, long before the chain on the gate, long before the glossy brochure. She'd been waiting, patient as a spider, for her chance. Mom had seen it and planned accordingly. My job now was to carry that plan to the end without flinching. I turned from the window and went to the kitchen. I washed my coffee mug. I watered the basil on the sill, pinched off a flower bud before it could steal flavor from the leaves. Simple things. The sky went dark and I didn't turn on the light. In the dimness, the apartment felt like a cocoon. I thought of the promise in the covenant, 10 years of keeping the garden alive, 10 years of planting and pruning. 10 years of listening to the soil the way Mom taught me, of teaching kids that carrots grow underground and that patience is a kind of love. I felt the weight of that promise and it didn't scare me, it steadied me. I sat back down at the table and put my palms on the wood. "We're almost there, Mom," I said out loud, my voice barely above a whisper. "I won't let you down." The words hung in the quiet. I wasn't talking to a memory anymore. I was giving an answer to a challenge she'd left me hidden in leather and ink and a stitched pocket. I would carry it. I would see it through. I would show up when the bidding was done, and I would say the number that would end it all. I gathered the box, closed the flaps, and slid it under my bed. I checked the front door, the deadbolt snug and sure. In the bathroom, I looked at my face in the mirror. The circles under my eyes were dark. My mouth was a straight line I barely recognized. I ran cool water over my wrists and took one long breath. When I turned off the light, the quiet was so complete it felt like standing under snow. I climbed into bed with Mom's journal on my nightstand, the covenant tucked under it, and shut my eyes. The drumbeat of 2 days kept going, but now it was keeping time for me, not for her. I slept, not well but deep, like a root. The night before the auction, the garden didn't look like the garden. Big metal floodlights stood like tall, pale sunflowers, but their light was harsh and cold, slicing the dark into hard pieces. Workers moved like shadows, dragging cables across the ground, stomping the mulch flat. A generator chugged near the gate, making the air taste like metal and oil. They stacked rows of white folding chairs in neat lines where we used to lay down cardboard to smother weeds. The podium went up right beside the fig tree, the same spot where Mom used to sit and tell me what needed pruning. A man tested the microphone, and the feedback screeched so loud it made a couple birds burst out of the branches and shoot into the night. Carla was there with a clipboard and clean, sharp lines from her smile to her jaw. She moved from person to person, pointing with her pen as if she were calling out constellations, as if she were guiding sailors home and not sinking my whole life. Her voice carried over the generator. Wind tugged at her hair. She looked like she owned the weather. She directed people where to put the catering table. She corrected the angle of the chairs. Every small thing got arranged just so. I watched from my window with the lights off in my apartment, my forehead leaning against the cool glass. The garden in this bright, fake light looked smaller, more fragile, as if a wave could wash right over it. Beside their production canvas banners, a stand with shiny flyers, a cooler full of bottled water, my envelope with the covenant inside felt thin and silly. A piece of paper against an army. I pictured holding it up and having the wind pluck it out of my fingers, fly it into the fig tree, send it skittering down the sidewalk like a leaf. My stomach rolled at the thought. The crowd that would fill those chairs tomorrow would be loud and sure. They'd come with checkbooks and plans and smiles that didn't care about what came before. The floodlights kept humming. The generator coughed and then settled back into its dull moan. The workers strapped a long microphone to the top of the podium and tested it again. In that clear, too bright glow, the fig leaves showed their veins like green hands held up to the sun. One of the men kicked at the ground and sent a spray of soil against the base of the tree. The dirt hit the bark and stuck like freckles. I pressed my fist to my mouth. It felt like I was watching a hospital room through a window, watching strangers push the bed closer to a machine. I closed my eyes, but even with my lids shut, the white light seeped through. The whole thing felt bigger than me, bigger than anything I could stop. A ragged thought ran through me: she's going to win. She's going to stand at that podium and sell the life out of this place, and I will be one more person in the dark watching it happen. As the workers packed up for the night and the lights finally blinked off, the garden fell into deep shadow again. The darkness wrapped around it like a blanket, all the edges gone. I could hear a cricket start up, brave and steady. The smell of diesel faded, and for a breath I could almost catch the sweet, bruised scent of basil. I stood very still and held that tiny breath like a secret. When the lights were gone, doubt came in to fill the space they left. It came quiet and sharp and quick. I turned on a lamp and laid the envelope on the table, right on top of the glossy brochure with Mom's name printed in swirls. I slid the paper out and unfolded it, smoothing the creases with the side of my hand the way Mom taught me to flatten seed packets so they'd stack better. What if I had read it wrong? The words were simple, but my head was loud. What if some old file in some drawer was missing? What if there was a tiny line I'd skipped over that changed everything? I blinked, and the words seemed to wiggle like bugs under a jar. I wiped my eyes with the back of my wrist and tried again. The city had changed since 1994. Everything was shiny now, with barcodes and screens. A piece of paper with a raised stamp felt like something from a museum. Carla had teams of people. She had a microphone and a stage and chairs and a banner that made the garden seem like a brand. I had one man who liked the taste of Mom's tomatoes and a plan that lived in the space behind my ribs. I could feel my smallness the way you feel a bruise when you bump it again by accident. I could hear every old phrase that had been tossed my way when I was a girl. Quiet, nice, helpful, the extra daughter, the one who stayed and watered. I remembered board games where Carla changed the rules while we were playing. I remembered her smile when she did it, bold and unbothered. I remembered how I just sit there confused because I believed in the rules. She believed in winning. My breath went shallow. I pressed my palm to the table to steady it. A stray thought popped in: call Martin. I imagined his calm voice, the way he spoke like he was measuring his words and they were always the right size. But it was late. And this was my weight. No one else could carry it. Even if he answered, he would tell me the same thing he told me before. Wait, show up, hold your ground. I read the covenant again, slower. The letters didn't blur that time. The words were still there. My name, plain as a seed label, the promise of 10 years, the price that sounded like a joke until you knew the truth behind it. I set the paper down gently like it could be bruised and leaned back in the chair. I thought of the garden as a person. I thought of watching it breathe. I closed my eyes and pictured Mom at the kitchen sink, standing in the slanted light of late afternoon, her back curved a little from years of bending over beds. The way she pressed soil between her fingers and made a ball, then opened her hand and watched it crumble. Good structure, she'd say, her voice low and pleased. I thought of her hands, their small scars, the strength in the thumb that could break a stem with one precise pinch. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. She could stop you with a look. Every fight she ever won, she won by outlasting the weather. She had believed in this plan enough to sew a pocket into a book and tuck a document inside it like a seed you're saving for the right spring. She had believed in me. The thought wiped a clean line through all the buzzing worry. The covenant wasn't just a rule on paper, it was my mother's hand on my shoulder saying, I know you, I trust you, do it. I got up and crossed the room. Her gardening journal sat on the nightstand like an old friend waiting to be picked up. I opened it to the page with the pressed fig leaf, its veins still visible, the green turned soft brown. I traced them with my fingertip. The pocket in the back cover was flat again, the secret taken and turned into a promise. I pressed the journal to my chest and felt the rough edge of the leather against my chin. I set it down and went to the closet. I pulled out my old black dress and laid it over a chair. Then I reached for my boots, the ones with dirt in the treads I could never quite get out. I dug a small shoulder bag from the hook by the door and put the envelope inside. I added a bottle of water. I stood there and practiced saying the words in a whisper, the way you practice a speech so the words don't stick in your mouth when you need them. $1. The syllables were simple, the meaning was not. I turned off the lamp and let the apartment go dark. From the window, the garden was a shadow with edges I knew by heart. Somewhere in there, a cat jumped down from the fence and landed with a soft sound. A siren wailed a few blocks away, then faded. I lay down and closed my eyes. Fear didn't leave, it settled like a layer of mulch that would keep the soil cool, not suffocate it. I held on to one clear thought until sleep finally came. I will see this through. No matter the outcome, I'll show up and do my part. Auction day was hot the moment the sun climbed above the buildings. The air felt heavy, sticky on my skin, like walking through soup. I tied my hair back, slid into the black dress, and pulled on my boots. The leather creaked a little as I laced them tight. I tucked the envelope into my bag, checked it once, then again, even though I knew it was there. I took the stairs down and stepped into the street. Heat rose up from the sidewalk like a breath from the city itself. By the time I reached the garden, a crowd had already gathered. Men and women in light suits fanned themselves with the bidding paddles they'd been handed at the gate, the numbers flashing white against tan faces. A teenager with a stack of brochures kept peeling them off and pressing them into hands. The white chairs were filled with people who smelled like cologne and money and impatience. Victor Grant stood at the front, his jaw tight, his tie a bright stripe of blue that looked like a flag. He glanced at his watch and then at the fig tree like it was something in his way, not something that had fed kids for 2 decades. The sound system buzzed. Peter Lawson, the auctioneer, stepped up to the microphone. He wore a suit the color of wet cement and a smile that showed all his teeth. He clapped his hands once and the speakers popped. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, smooth as a radio host. The crowd shifted forward as if pulled by a string. Carla stood to the side of the podium, beaming, one hand light on the edge as if she needed to touch it to make it real. Her dress was an expensive shade of white that didn't show sweat. She looked out over the heads, scanning faces like a queen enjoying her parade. Her gaze slid right past me. To her, I was another body near the back, black dress blending into black shade. I stood by the gate, half in sun, half in shadow, the iron warm against my arm. The envelope felt like a small weight in my bag, steady and sure. I could see the scuffed toes of my boots against the trampled grass. Near the third row, by the edge of a crushed basil patch, Martin sat, his jacket off, a simple tie loose at his throat. He didn't look at me, he didn't need to. The knowledge of him there was like a cool glass of water in a hot room. The fig tree above us rustled, the leaves whispering a language I knew. A bee moved from one half-broken flower to another, steady in its work, uncaring about humans and their games. A bit of microphone hiss rose and fell like the sea. The generator was gone, replaced by the hum of many voices, some slow, some fast, all waiting. Peter Lawson tapped the mic again, murmured something to a sound guy, then smiled wider. "Welcome," he said, and his voice poured out over the crowd, sticky sweet. "You're here to make history." The phrase made a couple people chuckle, made others sit a little taller. I didn't move. From where I stood, I could see the edge of the brochure banner where Mom's name looped in fake gold. I could see the notch in the podium where someone had banged it when they were setting up last night. I could see a smear of dirt on the corner of the stage where a shoe had dragged. These small things grounded me. They were real when everything else felt like a show. Sunglasses flashed. A woman dabbed her upper lip with a folded napkin. A man loosened his tie, looked at Victor, and then rolled his shoulders like he was warming up for a game. Carla's smile didn't waver. She leaned in and whispered to Peter. He nodded, raised a hand, and the room without walls got very quiet. I took a slow breath. My heart thumped hard, not wild, but steady like a drum calling soldiers to hold their line. I wasn't going to speak yet. That was the plan, let the heat rise, let greed thicken the air until it was hard to breathe, then cut through it with the smallest number a person can say. I pressed my fingers to the strap of my bag and kept my eyes on the podium, waiting for my cue. The fig leaves stirred again, a soft applaud only I could hear. Peter Lawson rolled his shoulders and started his chant, that quick up and down voice that makes numbers sound like a song. We'll open at 200,000, he said, and the first paddle went up before he even finished the sentence. 200, do I hear 250? Another hand. Another, the air tightened with the sound of money. Numbers bounced off the speakers and came back to us like heat off the pavement. 300. A gray-haired man in a linen jacket lifted his paddle like he was swatting a fly. 350. A woman with a hard smile and a square-cut diamond barely raised hers at all, like the paddle was an extension of her hand. A soft ooh went through the crowd. Peter's voice sped up, chasing the climb. 400. 450. The paddles rose, fell, rose again. Sweat gathered along hairlines and slid down necks. The fans passed from hand to hand, stirring the thick air without cooling it. Carla glowed. There's no other word. She kept her eyes on Peter, but her smile aimed at the crowd. A bright, fixed beam pointed at the future she thought she was building. Every new number added a little more shine. She swayed with the rhythm of the chant, her fingers tapping the podium, a silent drum that matched the pounding in my chest. I didn't move. I watched. Victor Grant stood in the very front row, his chin up, jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled neat to the elbow. He didn't bother fanning himself. He just lifted his paddle when he felt like it, cutting off other bids with clean, sharp moves. The people near him watched him the way birds watch a cat crossing a yard, eyes bright and cautious. 500, Peter called, and the crowd shifted, a ripple made of bodies and breath. A hush rode the top of the noise. $500,000 hanging over soil that had grown more tomatoes than I could count. 550, a new bidder I hadn't seen before, thin and really tan, lips pressed flat. Victor barely waited, his paddle went up and came down again. Peter laughed into the microphone, the sound bouncing off the fig tree and back to us. 600, 620, 630, 640, the numbers stacked like bricks. Somewhere behind me a kid complained that he was hot. Somewhere to my left a phone buzzed and buzzed, unanswered. The garden smelled like crushed basil and clean sweat and old bark warmed by sun. The fig leaves above us stirred, their shadows flashing across faces and laps, over bare knees and brown shoes. 650, Peter sang, and the chant wobbled. Victor's paddle was up. 2 rows back, the square diamond woman hesitated, glanced at someone beside her, and then shook her head. The tan man looked down at his shoes. Peter stretched the moment like taffy. 650,000 going once. His voice boomed and then echoed. The echo sounded like a warning. Carla's smile widened in slow motion. She put one hand over her mouth like a movie star trying to hide delight and only making it bigger. My palms felt damp against the leather strap of my bag. I kept my breathing even and low, the way you breathe when you need your hands steady. Going twice, Peter shouted, his face bright with effort. The crowd leaned forward without meaning to, a field of flowers reaching toward the sound. The silence that followed was a held breath, long and thin. It was my moment. The rope was pulled tight. All I had to do was cut it. I stepped forward and the hot grass brushed my ankles. The murmur spread ahead of me like ripples in a pond, the way people shift when a stranger moves toward the front at church. I didn't hurry. I could feel the beat of my heart in the bottoms of my feet. The heads in the first rows turned, one after another, following the line of my shoulder, my arm, the plain black of my dress. I saw Carla's smile freeze, then flicker, then try to reset itself. She knew the outline of me, she just didn't know what I was carrying. I stopped at the edge of the little stage, the fig trees shade cool on the side of my face. $1, I said. My voice came out quiet, but quiet travels just fine when the entire world has gone still. It slid under the last of Peter's echo and settled on the ground like a coin. A few people laughed. It wasn't kind laughter, it was nervous and short, the way people laugh when someone says the wrong thing at the wrong time. Victor's mouth pulled tight, he looked at me like I was an itch. Peter blinked and leaned into the microphone. We have $651, I said again, louder, and I lifted the paper. The notary seal caught a line of sunlight and flashed for a second, a small sunrise on old paper. As per the caretaker's covenant tied to this land, I said, it's in the record. Upon the owner's death, the designated caretaker has the right to buy for $1 as long as the garden stays a garden for the next 10 years. The words tasted like iron and relief. Security, Carla snapped, snapping the word like she could break it in two. Her voice cracked through the microphone raw. No one moved. We didn't have security. We had gardeners and developers and a fat bumblebee drifting lazy as a toy over the third row. Martin stood. He didn't wave. He didn't grandstand. He just walked the aisle like it was a grocery store and handed Peter the paper with a nod. "Read it," he said, his voice easy. The handoff was simple and final, like passing a trowel to the person kneeling beside you. Peter looked down, then back up at the crowd, then down again. The smile slid from his face like water. The microphone squeaked once against his tie. "One moment," he said to the crowd, but his voice had lost its honey. He bent and read. The leaves whispered overhead. Heat pressed on the back of my neck. Carla reached out and grabbed for the paper with a jerk of her hand. Martin let her take it. Her eyes raced across the lines, quick as a startled bird. She went white, then red, a blotchy, angry red that climbed her neck and bloomed across her cheekbones. "What is this?" someone in the third row demanded. Victor said nothing. He didn't need to. He was too smart to speak first. He watched the change move across the stage like a shadow at sunset. Peter cleared his throat. He tried to square his shoulders. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, but his voice broke, then came back thinner. "It appears there is a recorded condition on this property that gives a named caretaker the right to purchase for $1 with a promise to keep it a garden. We cannot proceed." The last words fell like stones into a lake. Carla's mouth opened. What came out wasn't a word, not at first. It was a sound I'd only ever heard once when a raccoon got its paw caught in a dumpster lid and someone freed it. That first noise of pain and rage and fear all tangled together, then words tumbled after it. "No, no, this is not she has no right." Her finger jabbed at me, then at Peter, then at Martin, wild and useless. The crowd broke into pieces. Some stood, some sat harder, some started talking fast as if speed would make sense out of it. Victor didn't move. His eyes slid to Carla and stayed there like a spotlight that burns. Chaos came like a sudden storm. Victor was the first to stand, not quickly, but with a kind of decision that made other people rise too. He didn't shout. He stepped forward and stared at Carla the way you stare at a car that runs a light and nearly hits you. "You wasted my time," he said, and the low heat in his voice did more than yelling would have. Others weren't so calm. A man near the back shoved his chair away and swore. The square diamond woman waved her brochure like a flag, her face tight with fury. "You told us," someone said, and then three others said the exact same thing at once. Carla turned in a frantic half-circle, looking for an exit that didn't exist. "It's a trick," she said into the microphone, and the feedback squealed like something in pain. Peter flinched. Martin didn't. He stepped to the edge of the stage and spoke in a voice made for kitchen tables and church basements. "There's a standing rule on this land," he said. "It's been there for decades. The sale can't happen. That's the simple truth." No one was listening to me, and that was fine. I wasn't there to be heard. I was there to end it. Carla threw the paper back at Peter like it might burn her if she held it, then shouldered past him so hard he grabbed the podium to keep from stumbling. She shoved through the aisle, bumping elbows and knees, ignoring the curses that followed her like thrown stones. Someone's water bottle fell and rolled under a chair. She nearly slipped on it, caught herself, and kept moving, raw sounds ripping from her throat like birds flying hard into a window. The people she'd been charming an hour ago let her pass but didn't reach out to help. Their faces had cooled into something hard. The stage lights were off now. The show was over. Outside the gate, a car door slammed. A second later, an engine roared, loud and ugly. The tires squealed as she pulled out, the sound slicing the air. Then the noise dropped away down the street, leaving a hot, simple quiet where the shouting had been. The crowd thinned fast. Anger looks big, but it leaves quick when there's nothing left to feed it. People gathered their things, muttering to each other, promising calls and threats, flicking sweat from their wrists like water. Victor walked past me without a glance, his tie tucked into his shirt, his steps even. He was already somewhere else in his mind, crossing this off his list and sharpening the next one. Peter stood frozen beside the podium, the paper limp in his hand, the microphone dangling toward the grass. He turned to Martin, his voice small. "What do we do now?" Martin gave a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Pack up," he said. "Go home." I waited until the last chair scraped and the last brochure fluttered down like a wounded bird. The heat had softened a little. The fig leaves clicked together, small and dry. Martin came to me then. He didn't reach for my hand or try for a speech. He gave me a nod, the kind that says everything without saying anything. "It's yours," he said. "You know what to do." Then he walked away, hands in his pockets like a man leaving a field where the hay's already been cut. The gate was still chained shut, a thick, ugly loop of metal through the bars like a grin that showed too many teeth. I slid my bag off my shoulder and pulled out the bolt cutters. They were heavy and honest, cool in my palms. I fit the jaws around the chain, felt the bite, and squeezed. The resistance held for a second, then gave with a sharp, clean snap that rang out like a little bell. The chain sagged, then fell in two heavy lengths that thudded against the sidewalk. I pushed the gate. It groaned like it usually did, a familiar complaint that made my throat tighten and my eyes sting in a way that wasn't about heat. I stepped through. The shade from the fig tree fell around me like a blessing. The air inside the fence felt different, cooler, greener, the diesel stink already fading, the crushed basil waking up and sweetening the space. They'd trampled the basil and flattened the zinnias, but the beds still held their shape. The soil was scuffed but not ruined. The birds hadn't left. A robin hopped in the dirt path, head tilted, quick and curious. I walked to the fig tree and put my hand on its bark. It was rough and warm and steady under my palm. I tipped my head back and stared up into the green, the sun making small stars where it filtered through the leaves. "We did it, Mom," I whispered. The words came out thick but true. The tree didn't answer, but a breeze moved through the branches, and it felt like one. I knelt, my knees pressing into earth that was ours again, and pulled Mom's trowel from my bag. The handle fit my hand the way it always had. I slid it into the soil, turned it, and the dirt broke soft and dark, full of life. I flicked aside a cigarette, but someone had crushed into the ground last night and dug a little wider. The simple act of working smoothed the edge off the day. Sweat ran down my temple and into my ear. I wiped it with the back of my wrist and kept going, the way you keep going when a long winter finally ends and you can feel deep in your bones that spring is not a promise anymore. It's here. Revenge, like a garden, takes patience and steady hands. If someone ever wrote you off, if they treated your heart like an empty lot, tell me about it in the comments. Subscribe for more true stories of justice that grows slow and strong.